The topic today is know your motorcycling community. And when I was thinking about this theme and topic, I got to thinking about I can remember when I first got into sales and got a territory. And I didn't really know for sure exactly who to go call on or anything. So I had to take the time to learn and get to know the area. What type of businesses I had, what type of opportunities did I have, what the geographical territory looked like. If I could I cover it in a day, or did it take several days? I had to scope it out and look at it. And part of the things that we need to do when we look at our motorcycling community, we need to understand every community is different. Every group, every town, every city, every state has a different group of bikers and a different makeup. You can go the state I'm originally from in Indiana. You go up north, there's a lot of clubs, and it's a huge motorcycling. Down in the southern part of it, where you would think that it was a little warmer, it's more spread out and not as much going on. So you just need to know. But once you figure out where your community's at, you've got to, as a leader, you have to ask yourself a few questions that are important. Do you know your motorcycling community? Do you know what groups are there, who's there, what opportunities you have? The second one, after you've been in the community a little bit, does the motorcycling community know who you are? As I've traveled across regions and across the country, I've run into bikers at gas stations and things like that. And when you find out where they're at and you mention to them that there's a CMA chapter in their area, unfortunately, sometimes they say, I didn't know that. We never see them. How long have they been there? You know, that's kind of a little scary thought, but it's something to think about. Then you need to ask yourself a question: if you're not involved in the motorcycling community, why? If you're a biker and you like to ride, you would think you'd want to go where other bikers are. So that's an important question. The other question is, if they don't know who you are, how in the world can you ever minister to them? And then the final question you got to ask yourself, if you're not involved in the motorcycling community, what's stopping you? So let's look at that. The first fill in your blank would be ministry opportunities come from getting involved in your motorcycling community. I can remember when I first joined CMA, I really didn't know anything about group motorcycling, going out on poker runs or going to bike nights or anything. Any riding I had ever done before was out in the dirt, out in the trails, out in the woods, but a lot of times either by yourself or with just a couple other people. I really didn't know. But I started watching the chapter president in our chapter, and I was amazed at how well he knew what was going on. And every time we went someplace, somebody knew him. And I got to thinking to myself, I would never be able to do that. And I asked him, I said, how did you become so well known? How do you know everybody? And he said, it's very simple. Just show up. Just show up. That's what they're looking for. They need to see you. They need to see who you are, and they need to see you more than once. They need to see you time after time after time after time. In our member training, we've heard the term earn the right to speak. You earn the right to speak by being involved. Now, being involved means showing up and being willing to help in any way. It means just being a friend, just showing you care, and being willing to take the risk to be rejected. John Jr. was talking about that in the chapter when that group said, "We don't want you here." You just need to be willing to show up and take a risk. You know, I had a manager tell me one time, it's okay to mess up, just don't do it at a big account. It's okay to go in and mess up. Because you know what? You can't mess up so bad that you and God together can't fix it. So be willing to take the risk. Don't give up. Why is being involved in the motorcycling community so important? It's the way CMA ministers. During seasons of refreshing, we talked about the CMA way, biker to biker. What happens with the CMA way of evangelism? Well, what is the CMA way of evangelism? If you pull up the next slide, fill in the blanks. CMA way of evangelism is present ministry, servant ministry, and telling your story. Now let's look at present ministry. Folks, nothing happens unless you show up. You have to be present to build a relationship, to meet the needs of the individuals, to share Jesus or lead somebody to Christ. You can't do it in a Zoom meeting, and you just can't do it talking about it. You got to show up. Remember, just attending a chapter meeting and going home after the meeting does not accomplish the calling God has on your life. I know we have that all the time. People show up, we have big numbers at our chapter meetings, and then they all say, well, I can't go on the ride, I got to paint the garage, or I got to cut the grass, or I got to do this, or I got to do that. You might want to, in a loving way, remind them that there's 29 other days of the month that they can do that. But can they just give God that one day, even the day of the chapter meeting, can you just give God that one day? You got to show up. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 3, I love this because it touched my heart when I was looking at developing some of the messages for seasons of refreshing. In verse 3 it says, if the good news we preach is hidden behind a veil, it is hidden only from the people who are perishing. John Sr. talked the first night about putting a basket over a lamp. We don't do that. It doesn't make sense. It douses the light. But you know, when we don't go and don't show up, we might as well put a veil over the good news. And when we put a veil over the good news, you know what? It's not hurting us, and it's not hurting our fellow chapter members, but it's killing the people that need to hear the good news. It's hurting them. So when you're not willing to go, you're not hurting yourself, you're hurting them. And they really are seeking and wanting the truth. So don't hesitate to go. When you don't get involved, again, you're not fulfilling the calling God has on your life. The second one, being a servant, is being willing to help in any way. There are many opportunities to serve at events. Serving someone is when you serve someone, you're not expecting anything in return, and that will have a tremendous impact on the people you're serving. When you serve and expect something in return, they don't see you as any different than them. But when you serve and don't expect anything, it affects them. It builds relationships. We've all heard the term, here if you need us. That's our DNA in CMA. So servant ministry. And then the final one is being willing to tell your story. Share from your heart. People want to know why you care. They want to know why Jesus is important in your life. And if you share that, you can explain to them that Jesus can share and change their lives. You know, your story doesn't only have to be your testimony. Sometimes your story can just be sharing who you are in your life. I'd like to tell you a little brief story about a guy named Tom. We're going to call him Tom because that's his name. I met Tom for the first time at an ABATE meeting, and Jane and I showed up, and we had our CMA vests on and things like that. And from the moment we walked in, Tom was determined that he was going to be the loudest, filthiest mouthed individual with some of the raunchiest words and stories you ever heard. He was just trying to shock us and get us out of there. He didn't like the fact that there was Christians showing up at that meeting. But Jane and I weren't going to budge. We weren't going to worry about it. We were not going to get offended by what he was saying. We were there to serve, to join, to help, to build relationships and love on them. And if we were given an opportunity, we wanted to share Jesus. And over the years, the meetings went from really hard language to language that you could bring your kids and your grandkids to the meeting, because they started doing that. To one day they asked me if I would open and close the meeting in prayer. And then they started asking us if we would stick around, because there was a lot of times people that needed personal prayer and they didn't feel comfortable sharing it in the group. And we built relationships. That guy, Tom, a few years after Jane and I started going, I found out Tom's dad passed away. And during work, I took off a little bit and went over to the funeral home and showed up. Because you see, just a few years earlier than that, my dad had passed away. And so now I had something in common with Tom. And Tom and I talked. And the story I shared with Tom and the story Tom shared with me was about our dads and the relationship that we had with our dads. And how much our dads meant to our lives and how we were friends. And Tom and I built a bond. But over the time, each year when we'd have a bike blessing, it still didn't change. I go up and say, Tom, can I bless your bike? No. I'll just do the corporate blessing. I'd say, okay. Next year I'd come up and say, Tom, can I bless your bike? No. Well, this past spring at the bike blessing in Evansville, I saw Tom. I hadn't seen him for a few years, and we started talking. And I found out he had had some bad health issues and things like that. And we got to talking about the health and his health. And I asked him, I said, Tom, can I pray for you for your health? He says, yeah, I think you can. He says, you know, I ask the big guy upstairs every once in a while if he'll help me out, but he says, I don't think he's listening. And I said, Tom, he's listening to every word you say. But I got to ask you another question before I pray for you. Can I bless your bike? And he says, yeah, I'd love that. I'd love that. So folks, telling your story again all the time doesn't necessarily mean in the very beginning you got to get right into your testimony. Sometimes it's just building a relationship. The next fill in the blank is chapter presidents. You need to be reminded of one of your key functions. And this, if you haven't noticed it in the CMA handbook in section 3, page 4, it tells you in your job description, find out and get involved with your local groups and clubs in your area. Ministry opportunity come from relationships. Get involved and encourage your members to do the same. You see, as a leader, you need to lead by example. Your members are looking for you for guidance and direction. If it's not important to you, it won't be important to them. I would say the same thing to you area reps and state coordinators. If you've got a chapter that's struggling and you've got a chapter that is having a hard time, you got opportunities all over that area and they're not going, there's got to be a reason why. It might not necessarily mean that they don't care and they don't want to do it. It might mean they don't know how. And they don't want to embarrass the ministry or themselves. If it's important to you as a CMA leader to be involved in the motorcycling community, then it'll be important to them. Find out what's going on in that community. Plan on going. Call the president and a couple of the other members up and say, hey, I'm going to go to the event. How about you come along with me? You know, if you go, you all of a sudden relieve the pressure on them. I can remember the first time I took a mission trip, and it was so great that when we went on the mission trip, Roger and Raylene were leading it. Because it would have been scary for me to jump out the very first time and go on a mission trip and be leading the team. Well, sometimes they're just a little bit afraid. You know, your chapter presidents and your officers are just ordinary people that can do extraordinary things with the Holy Spirit involved. I want to tell you another story about that same ABATE chapter that just goes along with being involved and things like that. Was Jane and I, when we started going, we went every month for 7 straight years, never missed a chapter meeting. But yet, when we became area reps, we knew we were coming down to colors, and we knew on that Tuesday we would miss that chapter meeting because we had leadership. So I went to the director and I said, hey, Craig, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to be able, Jane and I won't make the meeting. We've got leadership conference down in Arkansas, and we're going to have to miss. He says, that's no problem. That's no problem. I understand. Thank you so much for letting me know. We came down to leadership and colors, and a couple of weeks later, I ran into him at an expo, and he says, where were you guys? I said, wait a minute. I told you we weren't going to be there. He says, no, I'm not talking about you guys. I knew where you were. He said, but you know, for 7 years was the first time no CMAer had ever showed up at the chapter meeting. You know, when I didn't go, they didn't go. And that was a shame. But there was a little civil lining because he says, you know what? We all sat around paranoid. And he said, somebody stood up and said, do you think the rapture happened and we missed it? I said, well, Greg, that's something to think about. The motorcycling community in your area may consist of many different types of motorcycling. We heard earlier when we highlighted the 4 different chapters how they were doing the same type of ministry, but they were doing it in different areas, different ways, and with a diverse group of people in the chapter. You know, but we all have one thing in common. They were all involved in the motorcycling community. You know, when you look at the motorcycling community, there are several different areas that you can get involved in. You have the traditional bikers. You have the sport bikes. You have the adventure bikes. You have the off-road. And you have racing. Now, when you look at that, everybody always says, well, that's all new stuff. Well, if you've ever been out to the Sturgis Museum in Sturgis, South Dakota, or really ever studied the history of motorcycling, the history of motorcycling is those cruisers showed up at an event, took everything off the street, off the bike, and they either raced them like sport bikes, they took them and he did hill climbs like adventure bikes, they did dirt track racing like off-road, and they just raced each other any opportunity they had. So it's all old motorcycling. It's nothing new. Each of these areas are unique, but they all contain the same thing. All these people like to ride. We have more in common with them than differences. The reality is a motorcycle is a motorcycle. No one expects you to know everything. But if you ride, you will fit in. You'll fit in with every one of these groups. Just showing up will open doors and touch hearts. I don't know how many times I've seen bikers on cruisers show up at a dirt track race, park their bikes in the gravel parking lot that was never designed for a motorcycle, get off their bikes and go in and flag the race, serve, do gear checks or something. But they show up. You know what? No one cares what you rode in on. They only care that you were there. Inside every community, there are areas that you can make contacts. If you want to get involved but don't know how, just look at these areas. Dealerships. You know, if you have a Harley dealership in town, you know that Harley dealership just about has something going on every weekend of the riding season. It's very easy to get involved at a Harley dealership because that's their DNA. That's what they do. But if you have a Honda or Yamaha, or you have a dual sport, or you have an off-road facility dealership, you can still get involved. If they don't have anything going on, go to them and ask them, say, hey, can we cook hot dogs Saturday at your place and just give them out? Do you have demo days to where you let people come in and demo? Can we help you out with those weekends? You know, dealerships are a great place to build relationships with bikers. You know, you don't have to ride the exact same brand bike to talk to these bikers. Sometimes it's just nice to give them the opportunity to make fun of you. And you make fun of them. Bike nights. Bike nights are going on all the time. They can be small little bike nights. They can be big bike nights. I can remember when Jane and I first got involved and we started going, there was a bike night every Tuesday night about 4 miles from our house. We decided we couldn't really make a difference going to every one of them, so we just continued to make sure we were always there on Tuesday nights. Now, what was really funny was when I first started going those bike nights, I rode a Yamaha. About 3 months later, I bought my first Harley, and I showed up, and you would have thought that I had a whole parking lot full of relatives because everybody was coming up. I didn't even get the kickstand down, and people were coming up wanting to talk about the bike. But the reality is it really wasn't about the bike. It was the fact that they knew who Jane and I were, and they knew there was something different when we rolled into the parking lot. To their great joy, I came in on a Harley. But even the Honda guys liked me. But you know, during that time period, as we would show up, it was just the two of us. And every week we would be invited to sit with a different group for dinner because they had tables outside and we would sit and just talk. Local ride groups, I got involved in the Hog chapter because I rode Harley. But you know something I found out here just recently? The GWRRA will let you join the Goldwing group and you can still ride a Harley. And I went to my first Goldwing chapter meeting with another couple, and they treated us great. And we've built some relationships, and I can tell you right now, through the wintertime, as we're not riding, I'm going to go back and I'm going to go to every one of those chapter meetings. That's a group of people that I can build a relationship with, and it doesn't matter what bike I ride. You know, when you get involved in the motorcycling community and you start building relationships, things start to happen. You build trust. You build respect. You build confidence. Not only confidence in yourself to where you feel more comfortable going out and meeting people, but people are more confident in you. You build relationships and you build opportunities to share Jesus. The most effective way to reach the lost is to be with them. You need to go where they are comfortable and meet them where they are. You know, we talk to chapters all the time. They say, well, I invite people all the time to come to our meeting, and they just don't come. Fine. Go to theirs. Jesus, as he traveled around, he went and met people where they were at. Very seldom did Jesus speak and preach in a synagogue. He preached on the roadside, the hills, the lake shore, things like that. Jesus went where they felt comfortable. He met them where they are. You need to meet them where they are. The last and final thing that I'd like to share is this. You can pretend you care, but you cannot pretend you were there. Thank you.